It's the Underdogs back with you for another fun-filled, action-packed college football episode. I am Jordan Brenner, joined, as always, by my co-host, Peter Keating. Peter, it's getting late. What do you think about the college football playoff?
Jordan, I think there's a lot of chaos, and I know that things didn't really change much in the CFP rankings this week, but I think the way things are shaking out, a lot's going to come down to conference championship games, and I just wonder, how all of this turns out to be preamble. And here's one thing I wanted to bring up about why that's the case. Why it's because nobody's good enough to bull their way through so that the conference championship games, either who's in them or who wins them, doesn't matter. They're going to matter, and here's why. Rankings, I pay a lot of attention to the SP Plus rankings at ESPN. Over there, Bill Connolly does a great job. And he has this thing because he tries to evaluate not just the forward-looking kind of analytics way of looking at teams, but try to evaluate teams by their resumes the way the CFP would or should, right? And he does this thing where he looks at how the average top five team, okay, the average top five team would fare against the schedule that each of the actual teams has faced. Takes that rating, and then he subtracts 7 points for every loss that a team has, okay? Here's what's interesting. Every single team in college football right now, as has been true for about a month, has a negative score. Nobody has consistently played at a top five, a regular historical top five level. And if they have, they all have at least one or two losses. So what that means is that as we get to these conference championship games, which are going to matter a lot, you may have teams, we're going to have, like, let's say Texas A&M wins out, right? Will they make it to this top 12, or will they even get a bye if they make it or win the conference? Or will a team that didn't make that conference championship but maybe is rated more strongly before that game, will they knock them out? And this is why, we don't have a consistent treatment yet of what one or two losses means. And I just think the committee has to make a clearer, better use of analytics in evaluating these 1, 2, even 3 loss teams, because there's not enough head-to-head action for everything to be settled within the next 2 weeks. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And there are two games this week that might, in one case, inadvertently, in one case, very directly, impact the number of big conference teams that get in. Obviously, the big matchup of the week is the top 5 showdown between Indiana and Ohio State. But I think we both feel like Indiana actually is in the better position with a loss. I think because they lose, they're not in the Big Ten title game. They really, very likely, they would get a second loss as they finish the season with Purdue. So I think we agree that an 11-1 Indiana team gets into the playoffs. What's interesting is if Ohio State loses to Indiana, is there a scenario where they don't get in with 2 losses? Probably not. But the other game, Peter, that's especially on a show called The Underdogs, that is super interesting, we've been pointing ahead to this for a long time now, is Army against Notre Dame. And I'm wondering if you think this is a play-in game. And I say that because, A, can Notre Dame, if they lose, get in with 2 losses to Northern Illinois and Army? And B, if Army wins, and let's say they then win out and go undefeated, tell me why they shouldn't be in the playoff.
If Army wins and goes undefeated, they're going to make the playoff. Now, the question, right? I mean, you have a great.
Are you 100% confident with that?
I would well, no, but that's because I'm assuming that you go to 12 teams, undefeated teams with with big wins, on at least one big win on their resume, are going to make the playoff. If that's not the case, then what we're talking about is even more true. Then you have to come up with your justification for putting a 2-loss team in ahead of an undefeated team with a big win on their resume. And I see no evidence the committee has done that consistently yet. So
I'm going to go on record saying if Army wins, they should be in the playoff no matter what. Again, undefeated Army. And in fact, if they win out and Boise State wins out, both teams belong. Army doing well shouldn't move Boise State down the rankings because the committee only wants one of them.
Right, but
So,
that's what actually Nicole Auerbach was talking with us about last week, which
mhm,
is it's akin to the bubble watch in March Madness now, right? That all of
right.
a sudden your team's chances might depend on some completely unrelated squad, and they're playing for their lives because of a bad loss back in November, right? That's kind of crazy. But let me ask you this:
Hmm.
last week, you were like, do we really have to explain to fans like what were people confused about Miami getting the bye, right? Well, Boise State has kind of moved itself. Like, what are
Yeah.
they, 12th? And but they've
They're
moved themselves,
12th, but they get the
but they've
last bye.
moved into a bye
Right.
position, right?
Because they're
So
ahead of right now, they're ahead of the Big 12 champion. Yes.
right. So I think that, and they're playing great, and they're finishing the season against Wyoming in very windy conditions. By the way, Jordan, I know we don't need
Oh,
a weather related under this week, but
huh?
Wyoming can't score. Boise State runs and runs some more. The under on that game, the last I saw was something like 55 and a half. That's a very high number. Just want to bring that up.
But just to put a fine point on what we were just talking about. Okay,
Yes.
let's fast forward a week. Let's say Ohio State beats Indiana. Let's say Boise State wins again. Let's say Army beats Notre Dame. Okay. I mean, the easiest. This should not be. It means Army's got to vault up from 19 into the top 12. Okay, I believe that. Notre Dame, to me, you fall from 6 out of the top 12.
Oh, so
And I
that's
think
who's gonna that's who's gonna.
to
I was gonna
me, that's
say
the easiest
who you gonna kick
swap.
out? Yeah.
To me, that's the easiest swap. But that's then when you start to get into, okay, do we end up with a 3-loss SEC team among Ole Miss, Georgia, Tennessee? Like, I have a hard time taking the 5th or 6th best team from a conference like that with 3 losses over an undefeated Army team. The other thing, obviously, I really think we're at the point now where it's an either or with Miami or SMU. It's certainly an either or with the 3 Big 12 teams, BYU, Colorado, Arizona State. And again, just to say it again, I do not think it should be an either or with Army and Boise State if that situation somehow arises.
Well, if you take whatever system you like and you just average the strength of the teams in each conference, okay? The SEC, it's not a two-conference world, Jordan. It's not a four-conference world. The SEC is more than however you want to do this. You come up with it. The average rating of the teams in the SEC is more than a touchdown better, and it's a huge conference, right? Than the Big Ten. So I think what I think is that we all of us who care about doing this in a smart way have to really be willing to say, hell yeah, take a 3-loss team from the SEC over, you can say over Notre Dame or you can say over Army, but I want it on the record first that, yeah, a 3-loss team from an 18-team conference who had who scheduled tough opponents within the by far the best opponent, conference in the country should not be disqualified if they have 3 losses. I have a really hard time leaving out Georgia and Tennessee or Ole Miss from this equation. Whoever you want to throw out. I mean, can we at least agree on that first?
Well, yes and no. Here's what I'm
Because
struggling
I
with.
mean,
Okay,
don't you think they should like force these teams to play 9 or 10 conference games as a condition of having a 12-team playoff? And you can make the playoffs with 2 or 3 losses, but you have to have a record of playing 10 teams from inside your tough conference.
perhaps, but doesn't that just exacerbate the differences then between conferences?
That horse is long out of the barn. That's what I think people don't want to admit, that this whole system is collapsing into one, not just 4 or 2, maybe one super conference that can pay 100. Every team can play $100 million in NIL money to assemble these super rosters. But that's where the sport's going.
Right. But before we get too far afield, let's talk about flies in the ointment. Okay. Look, I can't even make sense of all the SEC permutations right now of who gets in
All
the
right,
conference championship game and who doesn't. Okay. But what I can tell you is one of the teams that we really like as a dark horse title contender because of the high range of outcomes they have has a really tricky game this week. And Ole Miss goes to Florida in a noon
Mm-hmm.
start. Um, they lose at Florida. That's 3 losses. They're done. And that suddenly opens up a lot of other avenues, including for a team that you really like, South Carolina, which also has 3 losses and could theoretically run the table with a win against Wofford and then win at Clemson, which would matter. So I'm curious if there's any other. There's been an upset every week. If there's any other games this week that we're sort of counting on victories, maybe something weird happens and And again, like we said, Ole Miss loses. Obviously, Georgia's not losing to UMass, but they're anything else picking,
Well,
jumping up on your radar screen.
let's say this first. Um, Everything that I'm saying or you're saying analytically can be true, but you can still have left yourself no margin for error for losses because you had a bad loss or two early in the season. Ole Miss has got to win. I mean, I can go screaming until the new year about how Ole Miss is a top 5 team in the country, but if they lose this weekend, it's going to be tough. Secondly, let me ask you about a team. We talked about how great South Carolina was playing, and they've worked their way into top 20 consideration. Jordan, what about Auburn? Auburn has been blowing the doors off for a while now. But
I mean, they're 1-5 in the conference.
right. But I mean,
You mean they've been blowing their own doors off?
I mean, I guess they're not going to cause any more. They're playing really well, and I guess they're not going to cause anyone trouble. But
They're playing well. They've lost. I mean, they did beat Louisiana Monroe last week, but otherwise these are their games. Lost to Oklahoma, lost to Georgia, lost to Missouri, beat Kentucky, lost to Vanderbilt. Like, what's there to like?
All right. Well, what about Vanderbilt? I'm just
What
saying,
about them?
are these also ran SEC squads likely to cause any more trouble outside of the Florida Ole Miss game that you mentioned?
Yeah, look, Alabama. I will mention Auburn just because it's a huge rivalry game and it's the last game of the season. Alabama has to play at Oklahoma and against Auburn. So yes, I think Alabama, just based on schedule, is probably the most vulnerable of these 2-loss teams to fall to a third loss, and that could get really, really shaky at that point. Otherwise, it's funny. A lot of these guys have already played their toughest games. Like,
Yeah.
I'll take it back. Tennessee goes to Vanderbilt, rivalry game, last game of the season. That's definitely an
Oh,
upset
okay. I'm
watch.
sorry. That was the Tennessee Vanderbilt game is the thing I was thinking but didn't have in mind. Yes. And let me ask you one last question. Anyway that a Big Ten team gets squeezed out of this, that if you're gonna knock off one or two teams because these teams we're talking about have to make the top 12, might something come out of the Big Ten's hide? I think probably not, right?
It would take an incredibly unlikely result. So is Penn State going to go lose to Minnesota or Maryland and give them a second loss? We don't expect that. Is Indiana going to lose to Ohio State and Purdue? Is Ohio State going to go down to Indiana and Michigan? And Oregon's in no matter what at this point. So the other question is then who replaces them? You're looking again at a 3-loss SEC team. You could make a case for SMU and Miami both getting in if they go unbeaten.
That's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering if the committee underrated Miami this week and has been underrating SMU all along. But you've been very steadfast in saying only one team from the ACC should make it. But that's kind of what I'm wondering, if there's room for both of those teams.
Yeah, and I definitely don't think you're getting a second Big 12 team no matter what.
So no. So wrap that up.
Yep.
What we're saying is we think Ohio State and Indiana are both going to be in no matter what happens in that game. Mm-hmm. And we think that Ole Miss and Colorado both have to keep winning in order to have any prayer of being safely in.
I totally agree. I actually think unless some really weird things happen, I actually don't think there's a lot of drama left for getting into the field. I think there's a lot of drama, and what you're going to see is we haven't had to discuss before because it was only 4 teams.
Right.
Is seeding.
Is the seeding.
Right? And that's where you're going to start to get the comments you get in college basketball where so-and-so was underrated, so-and-so got a terrible matchup. This team's a 7 seed. They should be in the top, there should be a 5, etc. That's a whole other discussion. But to me, right now, get in and then figure it out.
Yeah. And we don't talk about Oregon anymore. And I don't think they're a historically great team, but they played great in games that gave them the record they have. And I don't think anyone's knocking them off that number 1 spot.
TCB, Peter, taking care of business. Well,
that's what we do every week, Jordan.
Let's see, especially what happens in that Army Notre Dame game this weekend. It's certainly not likely that I think they're a 14.5-point dog at Yankee Stadium. But look, if Army loses, I think this, and there's no SEC upset, I think this becomes very clear cut. But if Army wins, and maybe there's one SEC upset, there's the chaos you want.
There's the chaos we want. So pull for Army.
Pull for Army. All right. Well, until then, I'm Jordan. That's Peter. Enjoy
Be
another
all you
week of
can
college.
be.
Be all you can be. The Black Knights of the Hudson. We'll see you next week.